In this video, I want to introduce you to the concept in C++ of exceptions. And so here I've entitled this particular video Exception Basics because that's what I want to give you is just the foundation for what exceptions are and how you're going to use them and just a little bit about the terminology. Now first of all, understand that you're going to write a bunch of code to build a program to provide some cool functionality. Now all the code that you write should run flawlessly. There shouldn't be any errors, there shouldn't be any problems, and I guess in your dreams that'll happen, but there are going to be exceptions to this idea. Some of the code that you write won't quite run flawlessly, and there is another word for exceptions, and that is errors. Now errors can take place in a number of different forms. You let your logic get out of whack and things exceed limits. You try to open files that for some reason won't open, or they've been moved. All kind of things can cause errors. Now when we're talking about exceptions, we are referring to code that does not run as expected. It's an exception to the rule of properly running code. Alright? Now exceptions occur unexpectedly. Alright? That's why they're exceptions. But we should expect them. It's kind of like the old politician's line, I can't remember who it was. It was Dan Quayle or somebody like that. If you remember who that is, don't worry about it if you don't. But they said, we'll be ready for the unexpected if it should happen when we least expect it, but we'll be ready for it. It was something like that. It's that circular stuff that you so often hear from politicians. But that is exactly what we're doing here. We're pretty confident that we've written perfect code, and if you've ever noticed when you write a line of code and it throws an error, it always kind of shocks you, right? What? And you always think there's something wrong with the computer, or something's wrong with the universe or something, but as it turns out, yes, you've coded something up incorrectly. So exceptions are what we use to deal with unexpected actions, results that come from our program. Now let me give you a little lingo or terminology that you're going to see concerning exceptions, and you just need to be aware of these. First of all, now the code that encounters an error is going to throw an exception. Okay, it's going to raise an error, but in these terminologies you normally hear it that we're going to throw an exception. Now we can manually throw an exception. I'll show you that later on in the examples. The code that deals with the exception or the error that occurred catches what is thrown. Alright, so just think about a little baseball and a glove. Okay, now when we're talking about throwing and catching an exception, we're looking for something to occur, an error, and we usually can guess what section of code fairly reliably that might have a problem. Now once an error gets thrown, or once an exception gets thrown, or it bubbles up, or whatever you want to call it, an error takes place, your normal step-by-step code execution gets interrupted. Now really what happens is your computer kind of freaks out, your program freaks out and says, oh no, wait a minute, here's a problem and I don't know what to do with it. And it does something we call bubbling up. It kind of bubbles up through whatever called that function to whatever called that function to whatever called that function, and it's looking for somebody to handle this odd thing that happened. Okay, and so the condition is usually, if it's gracefully handled, is thrown to a handler. Notice there's that word throw again. The handler catches it, and the handler should have some code to deal with the exception. Now how do we deal with an exception? Well, we'll tell the user, hey, this file has not been found. You want to check the name that you typed in, or give me a different location, or it's going to tell you, oh wait a minute, you're out of stock on this, you can't divide by 0, those kinds of things. Alright, now the way we implement exceptions in C++ is using a try-catch block. Alright, now this is the exception version of if statements. Now we're basically going to write the code that we think might throw an error into a try section, and really what we're saying is if you have any errors here, then do something. And the catch is really kind of the exception version of the then portion of an if-then statement. If this happens, then do this. Try says, try this code. If you have an error and an error is thrown, then catch it in the catch section. Alright, now here's what you need to understand. Uncaught exceptions. Exceptions or errors that happen that keep bubbling up and nothing catches them, nothing deals with them, it doesn't find a catch for them, they will terminate the program. And by terminating the program means the program stops, it's ugly, the user has to restart the program. It usually throws a bunch of gibberish up on the screen, and it bothers everybody. Now, here's the last thing I want to tell you in this particular video. Beware the murky world of exception handling. Now, I could say that a more positive way, but I think this one got your attention a little better. The more positive way to say this is there's a lot of different ways to handle exceptions, especially in C++. There's a lot of ways to do a lot of things in C++, okay? Now, when you get into this, and you'll see I'm going to throw some examples at you in a separate movie, okay? But when we get to that video, it'll probably be entitled Exception Example, okay? But there's a lot of different ways to throw these, and this is a good example of a place where I would strongly recommend you, outside the course of this kind of basic introductory C++ course, to jump out there and do some reading and some digging on exceptions, and you kind of learn a style that you like, kind of dig into what can be done, how many different ways it can be done, and so forth. Okay, so anyway, that's the basics on exceptions, and in the next 2 or 3 videos we'll dig into this a little deeper. Now, without going too deep into the exception classes, I just want to give you a little head start here on understanding the various exception types that are built into the C++ standard library, okay? Now, first of all, before we talk about those, understand exceptions of any type can be thrown, and they're often thrown as objects, like you're going to see in the standard library of C++, but they can also be thrown as integers or strings or anything, and there's a lot of pretty cool things you can do. I'll show you a couple of things in the examples later in a separate video. But now the standard C++ library includes an exception class, and that's the name of it, exception. And then within that, there are 2 categories of additional exception classes that inherit from exception. Now, if you remember from our inheritance videos, that means they're derived from exception. And these are called logic error and runtime error. And so we're basically dividing our exceptions off. And each one of these exception classes has additional child classes. And you can use these to look for certain errors, and you can catch certain types of errors. Now, when we've got the original kind of a parent of everybody exception class, and then we can get more specific and look for certain errors. Now, why do we look for certain errors? Well, if I can catch, for example, a logic error, now I know specifically what information to provide back to my end user to give them a clue what to help. Now, within the logic error tree, if you will, the classes that derive from logic error are domain error, invalid argument, length error, out of range error, okay, or the out of range class. And again, if this particular error gets thrown, if we do a catch on a domain error and a domain error gets thrown, now we know with a little more specificity now what's going on. And then we have the runtime error group of classes, and this gives us range errors, overflow errors, and underflow errors. Now, the way to understand these, and what's kind of interesting here, is that the logic errors and the runtime errors, these 2 classes inherit directly from exception. And so if you just kind of want to know, hey, if this is a logic error, then I'll catch logic errors, and if it's a runtime error, I'll catch the runtime error exception, and it'll give me an idea. If I want to get more specific, then I can use the domain, invalid argument, length, or out of range errors, and these inherit from logic error. And then on the bottom there, the range, overflow, and underflow inherit from runtime error. Now, I just wanted to kind of let you know that there's a lot of exception types already built out there. Jump out on the internet or grab you a good book on C++ and just start looking. And you can see there's a lot of things out there that's already built for the various general usual errors that you'll have. Now, you can certainly build your own classes. You can derive from exception. You can do all kind of cool things with this. But I just kind of wanted to whet your appetite a little bit and give you a little direction on the exception types that are already out there that you can just code to and use right now.